Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Tonight we're beginning a new short series, and I want to explain why I chose to do this, and I probably will not explain it each time. This series will probably be approximately 3 classes, maybe 4. And the logic here, I'm speaking to the ones who are live tonight and those who will be watching later, is most of you probably know we just finished I think it was a 4-month series called Ma'aseh Merkavah, the workings of the chariot. And along with the workings of the chariot, many times we mentioned what's called Ma'aseh Bereishit, the workings of creation. Both of these mystical traditions really go together. And so I decided that I want to now follow up with a series on Ma'aseh Bereishit. And when I began to prepare, I realized that I had already recorded much of what I was hoping to say. There is a 5-part audio series called In the Beginning that I did many years ago, but it's really excellent. And we have the transcripts. And then for people here, just maybe a year and a half ago, something like that, we did a whole series called Mysteries of Creation. And that was, In the Beginning, was basically about just the first day of creation. 5 classes on the first day of creation. Mysteries of Creation went through the 7 days of creation. And then I found that we had already done something very connected, which was the worlds of Tohu and Tikunei and Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. So this obviously has to do with Ma'aseh Bereishit as well. And then there was one other series that we did, which was only 2 classes on space and time. So these also connect to Ma'aseh Bereishit. So I was thinking, well, I better pick a different subject, because I've already given over what I had thought I was going to give over. I have all the transcripts, and I've mentioned it a number of times. It was Robert Berman, who's here with us tonight, who originally suggested I do Ma'aseh Merkavah. And then he once said to me, he said, it would be great if you do a 2-book together set, one on Ma'aseh Bereishit and one on Ma'aseh Merkavah. And that is very, very possible that I will do that. But then I realized that when I went through these other classes that I've already given, it wasn't in exactly the context of the mystical tradition called Ma'aseh Bereishit. And so that is what I hope to accomplish in the next few weeks, is what I call the introduction to Ma'aseh Bereishit. And hopefully with this short series, along with the other series that anyone can get to on our website, it's all there, all the other series, I'm going to put them all together in a book about Ma'aseh Bereishit. But I realize that there is some missing information. So that's just an explanation. I'm not going to do this every week. I'm just going to call this the introduction to Ma'aseh Bereishit. And therefore, I'm not going to be delving deeply into many of the subjects here, though there are a few that I will delve into because I don't feel they were covered quite yet. So that is the introduction to the introduction. So let us begin. When we studied Ma'aseh Merkavah, our main source was in the Talmud, in the tractate of Chagiga, in the second chapter called Ein Dorshin. That is considered the most mystical chapter in the entire Talmud, and it deals with exclusively Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah, the workings of creation and the workings of the chariot. And as we have learned, and we will deepen our learning of this, these two parallel traditions, mystical traditions, was really the basis of all Kabbalah that would come after it. These two subjects, Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah. And so simply, Ma'aseh Bereishit is the study of the 7 days of creation. And the text, of course, is the opening of the Torah. And Ma'aseh Merkavah, we learned that the focus is usually on the first chapter of Ezekiel, but that Ma'aseh Merkavah includes and encompasses far more than just that one chapter in Ezekiel. And of course, we covered this extensively in our series on Ma'aseh Merkavah. But Ma'aseh Bereishit is more contained within the 7 days of creation. And really, there's a second account of creation. If you remember, human beings were created on the 6th day. And it mentions in the first account, it mentions the creation of human beings. And then it goes to the first Shabbat. And that ends the first account. But then there's a second account. And in that second account, in the first verse and the following ones, it kind of reviews the creation of heaven and earth. And then it focuses on really the creation of mankind and what happened in the Garden of Eden. And according to tradition, the placing of human beings in the Garden of Eden, the commandment to eat, you could eat from all of the trees except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then they did eat from it. And then they had call it the punishment or the consequences of their eating from the tree, that they were expelled from the garden. And all of this is happening on really the 6th day. So in a certain way, the whole account of the beginning of humanity and all of the psychological, emotional, intellectual, existential questions that go with the creation of human beings is also, in a certain way, included in Ma'aseh Bereishit. So again, the basis, though, are the 7 days of creation. And now I'm just going to kind of go through history of other very, very important books that dealt with Ma'aseh Bereishit. So the first one really is the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, is considered the most ancient of all books of Kabbalah. According to tradition, it was the wisdom was initially given over by Abraham, Avram Avinu. But it went through many, many different forms and editing until the versions that we have today. And many people think it was Rabbi Akiva that kind of put this wisdom that had passed down all the ways from Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov into what's called Sefer Yetzirah. And Sefer Yetzirah, so it begins with talking about the creation of the world, because it begins with 32 wondrous pathways of wisdom, and then it goes on with many superlatives of God's names, that God created the world through these 32 wondrous pathways of wisdom. And these 32 wondrous pathways of wisdom are the 22 Hebrew letters and the 10 Sefirot. And that becomes the subject of Sefer Yetzirah. And it is given over in 6 chapters. And the deepest secrets in the world having to do with the Sefirot and the letters as the building blocks of creation, as the vehicles through which God created the world and maintains the world. So here you see Sefer Yetzirah is dealing with what we call Ma'aseh Bereishit. When Sefer Yetzirah was edited in the version that we have, was around the Mishnaic times. That's when Rabbi Akiva lived. He lived approximately 70 years before Yehuda Nasi codified the Mishnah. So there was another ancient book also at the same time of Sefer Yetzirah, also very mystical, very symbolic, almost abstruse in trying to understand it. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has a wonderful translation and explanation of this book, which is called the Bahir. The Bahir is very connected to the Zohar because both words mean to illuminate, to shine, to give forth light. Bahir also means like clear light, clarity. And that book was, like I said, very, very difficult to understand without a teacher. And according to tradition, it was composed by Nechunya ben HaKanah. That was his name. He is mentioned a few times in the Talmud. He's not one of the major players in the Talmud. He is mentioned, and usually mentioned, you get the feeling that he was a mystical teacher. According to tradition, he is the one who composed Sefer Bahir. Also, by tradition, he composed Ana B'Koach. Ana B'Koach is a mystical, we almost call it a poem, made up of 6 words in 7 stanzas. And according to tradition, encoded in Ana B'Koach is the 42-letter name of God. So the Bahir also is dealing with Ma'aseh Bereishit, the workings of creation. And then the Talmud is, of course, the Talmud comes after the Mishnah. Sefer Yetzirah and Bahir are mentioned, especially Sefer Yetzirah, mentioned in the Talmud and in the commentaries of the Talmud. Here, that's where we get into this one chapter in Masechet Chagiga, which is dedicated to Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah. Again, for those who followed our series of Ma'aseh Merkavah, we quoted from this tractate many, many, many times. And it begins actually more with Ma'aseh Bereishit and then gets into Ma'aseh Merkavah. So here I'm just going through a history showing that this tradition called Ma'aseh Bereishit goes all the ways back to the imparting of the Torah. that God imparted to Moshe, but its tradition continues throughout the generations. Commentaries are added, and there's always an attempt to understand these 7 days of creation from many, many different perspectives. Following the Talmud, and again, I'm just picking up the major books because at a certain point, especially after the next one I'm going to explain, which is the Zohar, then the commentaries on the Zohar and the teachings of the Zohar multiplied greatly. And then you started to have many, 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 many books, mystical books about Kabbalah. So after the Talmud, though, the major mystical book that was called released to the public in the 1200s was the Zohar. And the Zohar, just like we said about Sefer Yetzirah, is attributed to Avram Avinu, but the oral tradition takes hundreds, if not thousands of years to coalesce into written material. It was all given over orally. So the main person who initiated the teachings of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. But according to most people, he didn't write the Zohar, but he gave over the teachings, and there were manuscripts that were handed down, but it remained as an oral tradition until the 1200s, and it was finally called released to the public. It had been kept in secret societies that were learning Kabbalah, these mystic traditions of Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah. In the 1200s in Spain, it was finally released as what we'll call a book. And then later, of course, when the printing press came, but even before that, people then started transcribing it in scrolls, and it started getting around. And once the Zohar came on the scene, it became the foundational book of what we now call Kabbalah. Now, in the Zohar is basically an explanation of the portions of the Torah. It goes through from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus, all the way through the Torah, with many, many different tangents. And then there are other sections that were placed in the printed Zohar that fit in between the parshas. One of them is called Raya Mehemna, the faithful servant. There's one that's called Idra Rabbah, the great meeting place where Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai meets with his top students and gives over the deepest teachings in the world. And then on his day of his death, he gives over a whole series of teachings called the Idra Zuta, the smaller gathering. One of the sections of the Zohar, today it's usually printed separately from the Zohar, is what's called the Tikunei Zohar. Tikunei meaning the rectifications that are discussed in the Zohar. And this book is 70 chapters, and the theme that runs through it all is one word, Bereishit, the first word in the Torah, in the beginning. And it permutes the letters of Bereishit in many different ways. But the entire book, again, along with many tangents and side discussions, but it keeps focused on the first word in the Torah. And so this becomes one of the most important texts that is available to us now about Ma'aseh Bereishit. And in a certain way, in the Tikunei Zohar, but this is true of all of Ma'aseh Bereishit, is that it's almost like saying the who, when, where, how, and why of creation is embedded within these teachings. And then this brings us to the Arizal in the mid-1500s in Tzvat, where he begins to teach teachings that that are sourced in the Zohar, but until the Arizal explained them and elaborated on them, really, in a sense, no one really understood them. And the Arizal, of course, all Kabbalah today, I said before that the Zohar became the foundational text of the Zohar, but once the Arizal gave over his teachings, and the amazing thing is, all the teachings that we know from the Arizal were given over in approximately 2.5 years. And his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, and Rabbi Chaim Vital's son, who was instrumental in finally publishing what's called Kitvei Ari, the writings of the Arizal, which are really 8 volumes of his teachings, all given over in 2.5 years. But a lot of it has to do, and it begins, the Eitz Chaim begins with a discussion of creation. But the Arizal revealed things that really no one had heard before and became the basis of all Kabbalah since then. So all of this, I didn't get into any particulars, but I just wanted to show how Ma'aseh Bereishit begins with the 7 days of creation, and commentaries are added by the mystics, the rabbis, the sages throughout the generations. And so, in a certain way, Ma'aseh Bereishit is alive and growing because there are constant discussions based on these 7 days of creation. And then based on what the Zohar said about it, and what the Arizal said about it, what the Talmud says about it. And so the tradition keeps growing. It's the same thing with Ma'aseh Merkavah. It's not a closed book. It keeps on growing. So now we'll just bring some important general points of why is Ma'aseh Bereishit important. In other words, we could treat it like kind of like history. God created the world in 7 days. This is the history of call it the evolution of creation, and leave it like that. So first of all, the important thing of Ma'aseh Bereishit, it's a very simple statement, but it posits that there is a creator, and that the creator created the world. Now, this sounds like an obvious statement, but you should know that in the early 1960s, they did a survey of scientists all over the world and asked them a simple question: how did the world come into being? Was it created? And it doesn't say you had to believe in a God. It was created by something, or what's called eternal creation, reality, creation, the universe always existed and will always exist. There was no creator. It just always existed. This was one of the major foundations of the teachings of Aristotle. Aristotle believed in an eternal universe. And therefore, in our language, there was no need for there to be a creator. There was no need for there to be a God, because creation was always there. And so when they ask these questions of scientists, something like 67% of all scientists believe that the universe creation was eternal. Now, what's interesting about that is science purports to be the epitome of logic, that if you can't prove it in the laboratory, then it's just not true. Only things that can be tested and shown to be and verified can be true. But when you think about it, the idea of an eternal universe, well, where did it come from? So in a certain way, that position is somewhat illogical. Now, science might say, well, believing in a God is illogical, because you could always ask, where did God come from? But still, in our experience, things don't come from nowhere. But what's interesting, that would be like a mystical belief that something comes from nothing. And so an eternal universe, well, it's not even something from nothing. It's just there. And you don't have to give an explanation of why it's there. Now, one of the major ideas of Ma'aseh Bereishit is what's called Yesh, MiAyin, something from nothing. Meaning that before the Creator created the world, there was, in physicality, in material reality, there was nothing. And so God created something from nothing. But the mystery here, or the paradox, is that when we say something from nothing, that nothing is considered the ultimate something, because everything comes from it. It's like the womb from which the baby is nurtured and comes into this world. So when we talk about Ma'aseh Bereishit, we're talking just very simply in a belief in a creator, and in a belief that there was a beginning point, Bereishit, in the beginning. Now, many scientists have, in a certain way, changed their tune with the call it the discovery, or the current belief in what's called the Big Bang. Even though now people are questioning the Big Bang, not that it didn't happen, but was that the first Big Bang, or was that just a Big Bang in a series of Big Bangs? But if you go back, at some point, there was an initial starting point. Something kicked the ball into motion. Something created that infinitely small speck of matter that science calls the Big Bang, which explodes and is still expanding. How many years later that we want to say? And so many scientists now understand that there was a beginning, and that beginning had to come from something outside of physical and material reality, because physical and material reality could not just pop into existence without there being a first cause. In philosophy, this whole idea of everything has to go back to a first cause. That's what we call God. The Rambam, Maimonides, speaks extensively about our belief in God is this idea of what's called the first cause. And these are fundamental ideas in Ma'aseh Bereishit. Now, there's a statement in the Talmud that says, in God's name, God says, just like I create, you can create. It's a very, very important statement because it helps us understand why there's such an emphasis throughout Jewish tradition in trying to understand the workings of creation. Why do we have to delve into it so much? We're here, we exist, we believe, let's say we believe in God. Why do we have to really understand the creative process that went into creation? And so this statement from the Talmud gives us a hint to it, that God is saying, just like I create, you can create. Now, this goes along with part of Ma'aseh Bereishit, of course, is that God creates human beings in the image of God. B'Tselem Elokim. No other creation has that kind of description of being in the image of God. Everything that's created, from the mineral to the plant to the animal to the human, has a spark of God's energy in it, or it could not exist. And this includes inanimate material, rocks and water and metals. These are all inanimate, but without being energized by a spark of God, because we know that all of matter is energy. This was discovered 100 years ago, that all matter ultimately is energy. So we study creation because by doing so, it hooks us into God's creative process. And the more we understand about creation, the how, when, where, why, and who, the more we are connected to the Creator. The more we are connected to the Creator, the more we're connected to the creative process, because we know this is one of the important subjects of Ma'aseh Bereishit, is that creation is not a one-time event. That God is quite literally recreating and re-energizing the world at every split second. And we've discussed this, and I'll mention it again, that science now can actually record that along with what we'll call permanent particles within an atom, the neutron, the electron, the proton, there are, and a host of other particles now. There's a whole soup of particles within every atom that they can see and they can record, and they could know even what its function is. But there are also particles that come into existence for a billionth of a second and then disappear. And in our language, that is verifying this tradition that we have, that it's not a one-time creation. Every morning we say, Uvetuvo mechadesh b'kol yom tamim Ma'aseh Bereishit. In your goodness, you renew the works of creation every day. And so Kabbalah and Chassidut came and explained, it's not just every day, it's every split second. And science now confirms this. So not only is studying about creation inspiring and brings us closest to the Creator and gives us awe of the creation. But it also helps us connect to the recreation in every minute. That's why in Chassidut, one of the main foundational teachings, especially of the Baal Shem Tov, was this idea of not just God recreating the world at every second, but that we need to approach life in an attitude of this day has never come before, it's never going to come again. This hour has never come before, it will never come again. This second has never come before, will never come again, and that we have to train our psyche, our mind, our soul, our heart to renew itself constantly, which is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because most of us, we get caught in the cycle of rote and routine. There are certain advantages of rote and routine, but if there's not also an attitude of renewing ourselves daily, constantly, then we fall under the entropy of rote and routine. So this is such an important idea that just like God creates, He created us that we can also create. The last word of the 7 days of creation is la'asot. Asher bara Elokim la'asot, that God made to do. And everyone asks, it's so redundant. Why do you have to have the word to do? What does that mean? Everything that God made to do. So as explained, to do, la'asot, means letaken, to rectify. And this is the whole teaching that God has created the world in a way where we become partners with God in ruling the world and healing the world and fixing the world, improving the world, bringing light to the world. That is our function. That is our purpose in the world. So all of this is connected very deeply to the idea of Ma'aseh Bereishit. Now, when we were studying Ma'aseh Merkavah, we mentioned that every day, in very, very important part of our prayers, there's two sections that are taken, one from the experience of Isaiah with Ma'aseh Merkavah, and one from Ezekiel. And that's in our daily prayers, where we recite, Holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts. Excuse me, the whole world is full of His glory. And then the angels respond. Isaiah was hearing the angels saying, Holy, holy, holy. And then in a different experience of Ma'aseh Merkavah, Ezekiel says, Baruch kavod Hashem mimkamo. Blessed is the glory of God from His place. And the point is that Ma'aseh Merkavah was included in our daily prayers. And as we learn, not just once in a day, but if you have a minyan, then these are repeated within a day many different times. Now I want to make the same point with Ma'aseh Bereishit. So I just quoted one of the verses, and it actually appears in slightly different language 2 times in the morning prayers, that in God's goodness, He renews the works of creation every day. Ma'aseh Bereishit. So it's very significant, because if we look at Ma'aseh Bereishit as this mystical wisdom that is secretive and is only studied by those people who are on the level. And there's a certain truth to that. But here, the sages purposely put these words into our prayers. And so we say this twice a day, twice in the morning prayers. Uvetuvo, mechadesh, b'kol yom tamid, ma'aseh Bereishit. What's interesting, though, is on Shabbat, we repeat it a number of times. And so for those who were here at the beginning, I played a song, which was taken from the Amidah that we say on Shabbat. And so I'm not going to read all the words again, but the last words of this very beautiful passage in the Amidah that we say 3 times a day. Ashkenazim only say it once. Svard and Svardim, Hasidim say it 3 times. And it ends by saying, Chemda Yamim Oto Karata Zecher L'Ma'aseh Bereishit. That this is talking about Shabbat. And that God calls Shabbat a precious day, a remembrance of Ma'aseh Bereishit, a remembrance of the workings of creation. So in Shabbat, we say it. And then in, like I said, other than Ashkenazim, we're saying it 3 times a day. Ashkenazim say once, meaning on Shabbat. Right, okay, but then in Kiddush, we also mention Ma'aseh Bereishit. Right after we begin the bracha, so we say again that Shabbat is a zikaron l'Ma'aseh Bereishit, a remembrance of the days of creation. And so here, this is very, very important, especially about Shabbat, because Shabbat, of course, is the 6 days of work, and then there's Shabbat. And on Shabbat, we receive an extra soul. It's for those who know how to observe the Shabbat, it's a different world. It's a different level of reality. It's a spiritual universe that we're in Shabbat. And the fact that we're mentioning it throughout the Shabbat, the idea of Ma'aseh Bereishit, is because Shabbat takes us back. During the 6 days of the week, it's possible to think about and relate to the whole idea of Ma'aseh Bereishit. But here it's built into Shabbat. It's built in that the experience of Shabbat brings us back, especially to what's called the Garden of Eden. But even more than that, as we will discuss further on. Yeah, we're going to get back to this idea of how does Shabbat bring us back to the workings of creation. Okay, I'm just trying to see how we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to put it off. I want to continue this idea of what is it about Shabbat that brings us back to Ma'aseh Bereishit. And we can understand this by connecting the end of the Torah with the beginning of the Torah. And we just did this on Simchat Torah. We ended reading the last portion of the Torah, Zot HaBracha, and then we either took another Sefer Torah or we rolled the same Sefer Torah back to in the beginning, Bereishit, and we start all over again. In Chassidut, there's this idea, we know that this idea of juxtaposition is very, very, very important throughout the Torah. Why is one mitzvah next to another mitzvah? Why does one portion end and another one begins? What's the connection between them? Many times Rashi, this is the first thing he'll address in the discussion of the Torah portion. What does the beginning of this portion have to do at the end? So Chassidut does the same thing with the entire Torah. What does the end of the Torah have to do with the beginning? So some read it, the last words of the Torah, excuse me, are Le'enei kol Yisrael. All of the wonders that Moshe did in the eyes of all of Israel. That's the end of the Torah. In the eyes of all of Israel. And then Chassidut says, just connect it to the beginning. Le'enei kol Yisrael Bereishit bara Elokim et Shemaim et Arz. In the eyes of all of Israel, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So everyone will ask, well, what does that mean? In the eyes of all of Israel, God created the heavens and the earth. And so this is connected to this idea that when God was, call it, contemplating creating the world, the thought of Israel arose first. The thought of Israel arose first. And this is connected to a midrash that says that when God wanted to create the world, he asked the souls of the tzaddikim, should he create the world? There's other midrashim that he asked the angels, should I create, actually that is, should I create man? So the one that I want to concentrate is, he asked the tzaddikim, should I create the world? So everyone asks, what tzaddikim are righteous ones? There's no world. There's no creation. This is before creation. So who is he asking advice from? Who is he consulting with? And the answer is these tzaddikim, these are the future souls of Israel that would be created. In other words, just like we say that the divine soul is an actual part of God above. So here it's as if God is having an inner dialogue with himself, because the souls of the tzaddikim are an intrinsic part of God himself. So now we could read this again. Le'enei kol Yisrael Bereishit bara Elokim et Shemaim et Arz. In the eyes of all of Israel, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now this is connected to making Kiddush on Shabbat. And if we look at the words of Kiddush and then the function of Kiddush, we could state it like this, that making Kiddush is we are giving, as it were, testimony in our belief that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and in the seventh, he rested. Now, as we discussed before, and especially if we go back to a world that was inundated with idol worship, so giving testimony or asserting or sharing our belief that there is a creator and he created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. That's a whole other discussion, how we understand these 6 days and the span of time associated with it. But when we make Kiddush, and that's why the words, a remembrance of the workings of creation are included in Kiddush. And so we except for rare occasions that there is a tradition that some people sit for Kiddush even Friday night. Like 99% of jewelry stands for Kiddush Friday night. And one of the explanations is connected to what we're talking about. Because if we're giving testimony that not just in our belief, we're like stating it as a fact, we're giving testimony that there is a creator and God created the world and he created Shabbat. So how can you give testimony if you weren't there? How can we give testimony about the creation if we weren't there? You can't get a testimony in a court will not be accepted if you say, I know it from hearsay. So on a very, very deep level here, the way we're making Kiddush is asserting that we were there. Our souls were there. Le'enei kol Yisrael Bereishit bara Elokim et Hashemayim v'aretz. In the eyes of all of Israel, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, obviously, we're touching on a very, very, very deep part of the soul. But that part of the soul is an actual part of God above. And so on Kiddush, we're standing because we're giving testimony. In American courts, you sit in the chair. But we stand when giving testimony. So it's a very, very beautiful idea here. And it goes back to this whole idea of what is so important about Ma'aseh Bereishit. Why do we need to study this? It's because it's not just the initial point of physical material creation, but it also brings us back to the initial point of creation of the soul. And so the sages put both Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah, segments of them, in the prayers to let us know that these mystical traditions ultimately are not just for a secret society, that these teachings are relevant to us. And that's why the last class we did on Ma'aseh Merkavah, and I even stated that the very conclusion of everything we study was, well, how do we make this relevant and integrative to our daily lives? And there I gave a whole number of ideas and suggestions of how to make Ma'aseh Merkavah a living part of who we are and how we see the world, and especially how we understand the Torah and observing the Torah. But it's going to be the same thing for Ma'aseh Bereishit. Ma'aseh Bereishit, since God is recreating the world at every split second, then the more we know about how God is doing that, why is he doing that? What are the reasons for creation in the first place? All of this has to do with Ma'aseh Bereishit. So here we'll conclude for tonight. And again, this is called the introduction to Ma'aseh Bereishit. And we will go forward, and may we be blessed to really learn Ma'aseh Bereishit.